The first thing I learned on the black ship was that silence has weight, not the absence of sound. I mean silence as a substance, pressed flat against the skull, filling the space between heartbeats with something that is almost a voice. I learned this during the binding catechism, kneeling on the iron grating in the hole designated Processing Block 7, shackled at the wrists to the candidate on my left and the candidate on my right, both of them strangers whose names I would never know. Both of them breathing with the same shallow discipline rhythm that the wardens had beaten into us over the first 3 months of the voyage. I was kneeling. My knees had been kneeling long enough that I had stopped registering the pain as pain and had reclassified it as flaw. This is something the body learns when it has no other options. Above us, arranged on elevated platforms that curved around the hold's circumference in a tiered architectural judgment, stood the examiners. 12 of them, sanctioned Psykers of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, each robed in grey that was almost blue, each crowned with the iron circlet of a bound servant of the Astronomicon. Their eyes were burned closed, not sealed, not covered, but burned, the flesh there smooth and pale and continuous, as if the Emperor's light had simply decided that the visual spectrum was insufficient and had removed the instrument that made it necessary. I did not find this disturbing at the time. I had been taught on my homeworld that blindness was a consequence of sanctification, that the soul-bound traded one form of sight for another. I had been taught many things. The catechism had been running for 4 hours by the time I became aware of the echo. It began as imprecision. The prescribed phrases were simple enough. 72 words organized into 18 recitations, cycling without rest. The entire congregation of 347 candidates mouthing them in synchronized silence because spoken sound had been prohibited since the 3rd hour. Interior voice only. The wardens had explained this as a test of control. Only a candidate who could discipline unspoken thought was safe to examine. I complied. I had been complying since the day the black ship's cargo lifters had descended into the ruins of my settlement on Phaistos Secundus, since the day the assessors had pulled me from the line of the condemned and handed me a grey robe in exchange for the clothes I had worn since birth, since the day I had decided, on very little evidence, that this was better. I was mouthing the 12th recitation when I heard it. Not a sound. I need to be precise about this because imprecision in the description of psychic phenomenon is how candidates get removed. What I experienced was not a sound in the way that footsteps or breathing or the groan of a starship's hull are sounds. It was a doubling. The 12th recitation, I hold the Emperor's light as a lantern within, passed through whatever inner space I was using to generate it, and then, half a heartbeat behind, it passed through again. Identical phrasing. My phrasing. But not from me. I faltered on the 13th recitation. The warden 3 rows back did not move. The examiners on their platforms did not shift. Nobody screamed or pointed or activated a containment psi beacon. The catechism continued, and I continued with it. And by the 15th recitation, I had decided that the doubling was a feature of psychic resonance under group pressure, that being surrounded by 346 other sensitives in a shielded hull was naturally going to produce feedback effects, that this was why the test was conducted this way, that I was perceiving the edges of controlled psychic field saturation. I told myself this very clearly, in the way you tell a lie to a person you are looking directly in the eyes. the 16th recitation, the 17th. By the 18th, the echo had synchronized, not half a beat behind, exactly with me, syllable matching syllable, so close that I could no longer detect the gap. And when the catechism ended, and the examiners descended from their platforms and moved between us, pressing their burned smooth faces close to read the state of our psychic field, the way a doctor reads a wound, I felt the presiding examiner's attention settle on me like warm cloth, and I felt, from within that attention, a verdict forming. Stable, acceptable deviation within normal parameters. Proceed to dormitory assignment. The warden unlocked my shackles from the candidates beside me. I was given a numbered token. I was directed toward a corridor. I believed the test had been a success. I believed this with every part of myself that was still making decisions. The echo did not correct me. The dormitory decks of the black ship, designated transport vessel, Anima Imperatoris, sat 6 levels below the main processing hold, accessible by 2 cage lifts that moved slowly enough to feel punitive. The decks were divided into sleeping racks, each a shelf of iron 40 centimeters deep, stacked 4 high along both walls of corridors that ran the length of the ship's belly for what I estimated to be 600 meters. My numbered token assigned me to rack 2744C, which meant second deck, 7th corridor, 44th rack, top shelf. I climbed to it that first evening. The ship ran on an arbitrary light cycle, maintained by lumen arrays that dimmed to a red-tinged brown at the shift the wardens called night. And I lay flat on the iron shelf with my knees slightly bent because my full height exceeded the shelf's length. And I listened. The dormitory was never fully quiet. 347 candidates, spread across 6 corridors, produced a constant low acoustic texture. Breathing, the shift of bodies on iron, the occasional involuntary sound from someone whose sleeping mind had reduced its discipline below waking standards. The wardens patrolled in cycles, their boot rhythm steady enough that the intervals between footsteps became predictable, became metronomic, became something the mind began to track without being asked. I tracked it. I told myself I was assessing security procedure. I was actually doing what any person does in a new and threatening environment, building a map by which to determine where safety might be. There was no safety. The map I was building was of a closed system. The doctrine briefing had been delivered on our 3rd day aboard. A senior proctor of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica had stood on a raised dais at the center of the main processing hold, while all candidates were assembled, and had read from a prepared text in a voice that had the precise flatness of something recited 10,000 times. The text explained that we were Delta-grade psychic candidates, identified during screening, collected under the terms of the Black Ship's tithe for evaluation and potential service to the immortal God Emperor of mankind. It explained that untrained and unsanctioned Psykers represented the gravest threat to the Imperium, short of open heresy. It explained that without the Black Ships, without sanctioning, without the soul-binding process, we would become vectors for demonic incursion, living gateways through which the entities of the warp might enter the material realm. It explained that the Imperium's mercy was in bringing us here, rather than allowing us to be burned on our homeworlds, which would otherwise be our fate, which was in many cases still the fate of those who were deemed unsuitable during sorting. The senior proctor had paused at that point, not for dramatic effect, there was nothing dramatic about him. He had paused because a candidate 3 rows in front of me had begun making a sound that was not quite weeping and not quite hyperventilation, but was somewhere in the acoustic space between them. And a warden had moved through the crowd to stand beside the candidate, and the sound had stopped. The briefing had continued. We were told that obedience was the foundation of survival, that psychic control was a discipline identical to any other imperial discipline. Prayer, physical conditioning, martial readiness. In that, it required constant maintenance, and that its absence would be corrected. We were told that the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon that guided imperial navigation across the vast dark of the void, required constant sacrifice, and that many of us might be chosen to contribute to that sacrifice, and that this was to be understood as an honor beyond what any ordinary imperial citizen could hope for. We were told that the soul-binding process by which a Psyker's mind was anchored to the Emperor's psychic light was painful and might result in significant neurological and sensory alteration, and that this alteration was the cost of service, and that service was the only permitted purpose of our existence. I had listened to all of this and found it reasonable. I say this without irony. I had grown up on a world where psychers were taken by armed mobs before the age of 12, where any manifestation of psychic ability was greeted with the same community response as a fire in a granary. Immediate, communal, total. I had hidden what I was for 11 years. I had watched a boy 2 streets from my family's hab block dragged into the square because his eyes had been flickering during prayer. And I had understood, watching them burn him, that the Imperium's terror was not irrational. Psykers were dangerous. I had known this about myself with a cold self-knowledge that most people never have to apply to their own nature. I was a weapon that had not yet been aimed. The black ship was offering to aim me rather than destroy me. I would have agreed to almost anything. On the dormitory shelf, in the red-brown dimness of the first night cycle, I recited the Litany of Containment. It was not a catechism verse. It was a personal prayer, something the wardens had permitted because private devotion was encouraged as a stabilizing practice. The words were simple. I am a vessel of the Emperor's will. My mind is a closed room. Nothing enters that I do not permit. Nothing speaks that I have not sanctioned. My will is his will, and his will is my silence. I reached the last line. The echo reached it with me. It was so nearly simultaneous that I could not have proved the difference to anyone. I could barely prove it to myself. And the part of me that had spent 11 years deciding that things I perceived were not things I should report was very good at this kind of self-erasure. She was very practiced at taking an observation and finding the corridor that led from it to harmlessness. The echo was resonance. The echo was normal psychic bleed in a confined space. The echo was the natural consequence of 347 minds performing the same prayer within a few hundred meters of one another. The echo was not an intrusion. I lay on the iron shelf and stared at the iron above me, 3 inches from my nose, and I believed what I needed to believe. The corridor of wards was the formal designation for the passage connecting the dormitory decks to the training levels, and it was approximately 40 meters long and impossible to traverse without noticing what lined it. The hexagrammic wards were carved directly into the steel bulkheads, not painted, not applied, but cut in with tools that had clearly required significant effort. The lines deep and precise, each sigil rendered with the kind of technical rigor that implied centuries of refinement. Some wards were familiar to me, from the scraps of imperial lore I had absorbed during childhood. Symbols associated with psychic containment, with the closing of warp gates, with the breaking of compulsions and glamours. Others I did not recognize. All of them produced a sensation when I passed close to them that I can only describe as pressure applied from the inside. Not pain, but the awareness of resistance. As if the air around the ward symbols had a different density. As if whatever the wards were designed to exclude was something that had to be actively prevented from being present. It was during my third transit through the corridor of wards that I understood the architecture of the ship differently. I had been thinking of the black ship as transport, a vessel that happened to be carrying psychers in controlled conditions rather than, say, troops or cargo. The corridor of wards corrected this. The wards were not incidental to the structure. They were load-bearing in a non-physical sense. The entire ship was organized around the principle of containment. The hexagrammic patterns were part of a system, and the dormitory decks and the training levels and the processing hold were nodes within that system. And the system's purpose was not to transport psychic candidates, but to process them, to subject them to controlled psychic pressure within a sealed and warded environment and observe the results, sorting useful from unusable, sanctifiable from irredeemable, infrastructure from waste. I moved through the corridor 3 times daily. The echo grew clearer in the confined space, in tight passages, where the ward sigils were close on both sides, and the ceiling was low, and my shoulders nearly touched the bulkheads. I noticed that the echo did not fade. It should have faded. If it was residue from the group catechism, from the proximity of hundreds of other psychic fields, it should have diminished when I was alone. Instead, it was sharper, as if the wards that were designed to suppress and contain everything outside were simultaneously acting as reflectors, bouncing the echo back from the sealed surfaces, amplifying it within the space between the sigils. I decided this was purification. I had been told that discomfort during transit through warded zones was a sign of impurity being pressed out. The wards were doing their work. The clarity of the echo was a sign that it was being brought to the surface, where it could be examined and expelled. I was 11 years old when I first learned how to believe necessary things. I had been practicing since. There were minor corrections throughout the first month. The first was a candidate, named only by his rack designation, 2739C, 3 racks down from mine, same shelf level. I had not spoken to him, because speaking outside of designated communication periods was prohibited, but I had heard him breathing during night cycles, and had developed the involuntary familiarity with his respiratory rhythm that enforced proximity creates. He had a habit of pressing his face into the iron shelf and making a sound, very quiet, that the darkness turned into something private. On the 19th night cycle, this sound had escalated over the course of 2 hours into something that was clearly not private anymore. And 2 wardens had come, and there had been a brief interval during which sounds were made that I am choosing not to describe in detail. And then the sounds had stopped, and the rack had been empty at morning light cycle, and it had remained empty, and no explanation had been offered, and no explanation was expected. The candidates around me processed this information in the only available way. They performed an additional cycle of the litany of containment. The wardens noted this in their ledgers, visible on small data slates they carried at all times. And the notation was presumably favorable. I performed the additional litany. The echo performed it with me. The thing I suppressed, which I suppressed so effectively that it took me a long time to retrieve the memory clearly, was this. Before the sounds from Rack 2739C began their escalation, and before the wardens arrived, the echo had been active in a way that was not mimicking my own thoughts. For approximately 45 minutes before the incident, I had been aware of a presence in the echo that was not a reflection of anything I was thinking. A thrumming, repetitive, increasingly urgent structure that was not organized into words or prayer phrases, but into something more like momentum, like a wheel gaining speed below a threshold, where it begins to shake the frame that holds it. And then the sounds had started, and the wardens had come. And the absence of that presence afterward, after the silence and the empty rack, had felt like a specific kind of quiet. Not peace, termination. I withheld this from my next stability evaluation. I told myself I was withholding it because I had no certainty it was real, that psychic interference in enclosed spaces could produce auditory and pseudo-emotional phenomena with no external source, that the echo was my own resonance and not a perception of another candidate's deterioration. These reasons were not without merit. They were also not why I withheld it. I withheld it because reporting it would have confirmed instability, and confirmation of instability had a known outcome, and I had seen its known outcome 3 racks down. Compliance now cost me truth. I noted this transaction clearly and paid it anyway. And in the 4th month of the voyage, I was transferred to the training choir. This was a commendation, though it was described in purely procedural terms. The assignment notice arrived through the standard mechanism. A warden appeared at Rack 2744C during morning instruction period and handed me a designation card without comment, and I took the card without comment, and the card directed me to report to Training Level 4, Choir Chamber Alpha, at the sound of the 3rd bell. And nothing about this was communicated as significant, but I knew it was. The training choir was not available to all candidates. It was reserved for those whose psychic stability had been assessed as sufficient to allow partial guided linkage. The first tentative steps toward the astropathic function that would be required of those eventually assigned to relay choir service. I was, apparently, stable enough. I went to Choir Chamber Alpha at the 3rd bell. The chamber was smaller than I had expected, perhaps 12 meters in diameter, circular, with a domed ceiling from which chains hung at regular intervals, each chain terminating in a circlet of iron that was clearly designed to rest against the crown of a seated candidate's skull. The floor was raised at the center into a low dais, and the dais held 6 iron chairs, arranged in a hexagonal pattern, and the chairs were occupied by 4 other candidates, and the master of the training choir, who was a sanctioned psyker of senior grade, whose burned smooth eye sockets and systematic stillness marked her as someone who had been in service long enough that the service had become structural. She did not introduce herself. She said, "We will begin." The linkage was achieved through physical proximity and synchronized breathing, which produced a resonant field between the participants that the master shaped and directed. I had been told this would feel like the boundary of my own mind becoming permeable, not breached, but thinned, like cloth held up to light so that the weave becomes visible. What it actually felt like was heat. It started at the top of my skull, where the circlet rested and moved inward. And it was not immediately uncomfortable, but it was not the warmth of something benevolent. It was the warmth of something being conducted. I was a wire. Signal was passing through me. I could feel the other 4 candidates as presences within that signal, not their thoughts, not their private identities, but their psychic weight, their shape in the resonance field, the way they pushed and absorbed and reflected the shared current. The master was the organizing principle of the linkage, her presence not individual, but architectural, a structure within which we were all functioning. The transmission was simple. A short-range signal, a test of choir function, directed toward a relay beacon mounted on the hull. Under the master's guidance, we formed the signal, shaped it, released it. It was workmanlike and brief. What happened in the moment of release was not simple. When the signal passed through the linkage and out through whatever psychic conduit the choir formed toward the relay beacon, there was a gap. Not a gap in the signal. The signal was complete. A gap between the sending and the received. A fraction of interior quiet in which the linkage was momentarily open without being directed. And in that fraction, something leaned inward. I need to say very precisely what I mean by this. It did not enter the linkage. It did not manifest. It did not assume a shape or speak words or press against the ward barriers built into the chamber's architecture. It leaned, the way a weight shifts toward an edge without committing to falling, the way attention turns before intention forms. Something that existed in the space beyond the sanctioned conduit became aware that the conduit was open, hasn't oriented itself toward us, and for the duration of a single deep breath, it simply listened. The temperature in the chamber had risen by several degrees. Candidate in position 4. I had not learned his name. Designation cards gave numbers, not names. Collapsed during the post-transmission cool-down period. He fell sideways from his iron chair without sound, and there was blood coming from his left ear when the warden reached him, and he was removed. And the master observed the removal without expression and said, "Mismatch in resonance harmonics. Noted for record. Begin cool-down protocol." I followed the cool-down protocol. The echo lingered after the transmission. Every previous experience of it had been time-limited. It would appear during catechism or litany, or in confined spaces near the wards, and then it would fade when the triggering context faded. This time, it did not fade. It persisted in a low, barely perceptible way, like tinnitus, like the residue of sound in a space where sound has just been very loud. I performed my cool-down exercises. I meditated on the prescribed imagery, the emperor's throne, the golden light, the ordered hierarchy of service. The echo meditated alongside me. I went to my next linkage session. I did not report the lingering. The decision to not report had passed from active choice into habit. This is how these things work. The first suppression is an act of will, requiring conscious effort and generating a specific kind of anxiety, the anxiety of active deception. By the 4th or 5th suppression, the suppression precedes the awareness. The information forms, and the hand that would raise it to report is already lowering before the thought of reporting has fully articulated itself. I was not lying to the wardens. I was simply failing to raise a hand. There is a difference, and the difference is important to understand because it explains how a person can pass every stability evaluation while accommodating something that should fail everyone. The stability evaluations were conducted weekly. A warden with a data slate and a certified Psyker examiner would take each candidate to a small assessment room, and the examiner would spend approximately 20 minutes reading the candidate's surface psychic field for anomalies, and the warden would record the results, and the candidate would return to routine. I passed every evaluation. I passed them because the echo had learned to quiet itself under direct scrutiny. This was not something I arranged with the echo. I did not communicate with it. I did not instruct it. I did not negotiate. It simply became apparent over the course of several evaluations that the echo was less present when I was being directly observed by a trained examiner, that it receded slightly in the way that a reflex recedes when you know you are being tested for it, the muscle too aware of the observation to respond naturally. I noticed this pattern. The echo noticing things about the examination process was different from me noticing things about the examination process. I recorded this difference in the private ledger I maintained inside my own skull, where the wardens could not read it. The surveillance ledger was what I privately called the document the wardens maintained. I had seen the format of it once, when a warden had left his data slate on a corridor bench during an equipment adjustment, and I had been passing, and the display had been live for the 4 seconds it took me to pass beyond reading distance. In those 4 seconds, I had absorbed the column structure: candidate designation, date, category of anomaly, severity rating, disposition code. The disposition codes I recognized included C for continue, R for restrict, E for enhanced monitoring, and one I did not recognize that was a single character I could not read in the time available. I had a column. I had anomalies. I had a severity rating that I estimated was low, given that I had not been restricted or enhanced or anything other than continued. I had probably been continued for months. The echo had been quiet during every single one of those assessments. After I processed this clearly, my own internal monitoring changed. Before, I had been tracking my thoughts the way a candidate tracked them, watching for signs of contamination, flagging moments of doubt or disobedience, ensuring that my private devotions were genuine rather than performed. After, I watched my thoughts the way a warden would watch them, from outside the frame, looking for the patterns that would be concerning to an observer, rehearsing the surface I presented to evaluation, smoothing the areas of roughness that might catch attention. This was efficient. It was also the process by which a person becomes their own containment unit. The echo watched me do this. It did not comment. In the 7th month, the announcement came that we were approaching Hydrofer. The transit master's voice over the Vox address system was level and procedural, informing candidates that the approach phase would involve a series of preparatory rituals calibrated to the soul-binding process, that these rituals would include exposure to a diluted emanation of Astronomicon radiance channeled through the ship's psychic array, and that candidates should treat any discomfort during exposure as a normal part of spiritual preparation. The announcement ended with the seal of the Emperor, spoken in High Gothic, and then the Vox system clicked off. The counting began. I am using counting loosely. There was no formal countdown, but the announcement established a horizon, and horizons produce a specific kind of awareness in enclosed spaces. The awareness that what exists between here and there is finite, that the options are narrowing, that what has not happened will happen, and what has been deferred will be deferred no longer. The dormitory decks became slightly louder in an unspecified way, which is to say that the quality of silence shifted, became tenser, became the silence of held breath rather than disciplined quiet. The echo became louder in proportion. The preliminary Astronomicon exposure was conducted in the Chapel of Soul-Binding Preparation, a compartment on Training Level 2 that I had not previously entered, whose architecture was different from the functional austerity of the rest of the ship. Where the processing hold and training levels were bare steel and hexagrammic wards, the chapel had been given the visual grammar of sanctity. A vaulted ceiling painted in the imperial gold that has faded to brass. Recessed alcoves containing statues of the soulbound that wore expressions of either transcendence or agony. A central aperture in the hull roof, through which the ship's psychic array focused channeled energy into the chamber. We were brought in groups of 20. We were directed to kneel in concentric circles around the aperture. A confessor, human, unsanctioned, visibly nervous in the way of people performing rituals they understand doctrinally, but not empirically, led us through preparatory prayer. And then the aperture opened. Light is not the right word for what came through it. Light implies photons, physical luminosity, something the eye processes as illumination. What came through the aperture was a signal that mapped onto the experience of light, because the psychic sense expresses itself in available sensory metaphors, and light is what we have for things that reveal. It was Astronomicon radiance, diluted through the ship's array to survivable levels, and it was supposed to feel cleansing and purifying, a foretaste of the Emperor's presence, the benevolent warmth of divine attention. I felt burning, not metaphorical burning, not the burning of impurity being expelled, the burning of a surface exposed to something hotter than it was designed to withstand, the burning of friction, of edges abraded by contact with something abrasive. My skin perceived it as heat, yes, but beneath that, beneath the physical surface sensation, there was a structural perception, a deeper seeing, and what I saw was not singular brilliant. The Astronomicon, even at a fraction of its actual emanation, was not a single thing. It was layered, dense with layers. And the layers were not gradations of light or intensity. They were individual registers, each one a psychic signature, each one carrying the residue of a mind that had been fed into it. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. The lattice I perceived in the diluted signal was made of people. People who had knelt where I was kneeling and burned more completely than I was burning. People whose psychic structure had been harvested and organized and held in tense, continual sacrifice to maintain the beacon's reach. I understood in that moment that the Astronomicon was a wound held open. The echo did not recoil from this. It expanded. It fractured in the light, not shattered, but split into harmonics, multiple frequencies that each carried a fragment of the layered structure I was perceiving. And for 3 seconds I was not one person receiving a signal, but something more plural. A receiver tuned to multiple channels simultaneously, hearing the Astronomicon's constituent suffering in separate voices that were each complete and each unbearable, and each producing the same word in different inflections. The word was not a word. It was a pitch, a feeling, a continuous signal that translated as, here, I am here. I have always been here. You will also be here. The confessor's hand was on my shoulder. The aperture was closing. I was being helped to my feet. The confessor said, "The doubt you feel before the light is the last impurity. What remains after will be clean." His voice was the voice of someone repeating a text, not performing a conviction. He was giving me what he had to give. I was upright. My legs were functional. My stability evaluation, conducted immediately after the chapel session, showed no anomalous readings. The echo had spoken during prayer. It had not spoken words. It had spoken structure. The structure of 10,000 minds layered in sacrifice. The structure of the Astronomicon as experienced from the inside rather than the navigational outside. And what the echo had conveyed in the grammar of direct psychic perception rather than language was this: the light that is supposed to purify you is made of people who thought the same thing. I knelt for the evaluation and kept my field surfaces smooth. The sorting tribunal of Hydrofer convened in the orbital receiving station, designated Induction Platform Sigma 7, a structure that had been purpose-built for the processing of Black Ship's tithe candidates, and that communicated this purpose with the same architectural honesty as a slaughterhouse communicates its purpose. Everything in it was functional, scaled to volume, optimized for throughput, and utterly indifferent to the experience of the objects being processed. We were transferred to the station in groups of 30 via shuttle, and each group was directed to a waiting zone that was clean and warm and furnished with benches. And after approximately 6 hours in the waiting zone, each candidate was directed in sequence to an assessment booth. And in the assessment booth, a presiding assessor sat across a table covered with data slates and wore white gloves. The gloves were for psychic protection during the tactile assessment component. A certified Psyker examiner could read significant depth from skin contact, and the gloves reduced the contamination risk of prolonged contact with unstable candidates. They did not eliminate it. When the assessor pressed his gloved hands to my temples, I felt the contact as something more than physical. Beneath the white fabric was skin, and beneath the skin was a trained psychic receiver, operating in evaluative mode, and the contact established a thin and directional current between his receiver and whatever I was. I held my field surfaces as smooth as I had learned to hold them. The echo was quiet. I performed the internal landscape of a candidate whose only concerns were compliance and service. I believed in the Emperor. I accepted my function. I anticipated the soul binding with the appropriate combination of reverence and fear. The assessor stiffened, not dramatically. A small change in posture, a fractional tension in the hand still pressed to my temples, a slight acceleration in his breathing rate that I noticed because I had been living in close proximity to other humans for 7 months and had developed very precise, involuntary attunement to respiratory patterns as signals of emotional state. He stiffened, and the echo moved. I cannot describe this as something I did. I did not direct the echo to reach outward, but the echo was sensitive to the quality of the assessor's attention in the same way that a mirrored surface is sensitive to what looks into it. And when the assessor's trained psychic sense oriented toward me with a heightened focus, the echo responded by orienting back, by reaching along the thin evaluative current with the same directional precision the assessor was using, brushing against the controlled surface of his professional field. For 1 second, I felt what he was feeling. Beneath several layers of training in institutional conditioning, and what I recognized as a specific type of practiced calm that is not calm, but rather the performance of calm so sustained it has become structural, there was terror, precise, caged, functional terror, the terror of a person who had been conducting these assessments for years and who had developed the kind of intimate familiarity with contamination that produces not desensitization, but a refined fear. A fear that knew exactly what it was afraid of, and exactly how close it was, and exactly what would happen if the distance between the fear and its object collapsed by even a centimetre. He knew something was not standard. He removed his hands from my temples. He made notations on 3 data slates in sequence, his stylus moving with the mechanical efficiency of someone recording a finding they have already categorized. He did not look at me while he wrote. When he finished, he said, "Designation confirmed. Classification Delta. Subcategory Astropathic Choir Candidate. Scheduled for soul binding. Report to Preparation Cell 17. I stood. I said, "Thank you, Assessor." He said nothing. The echo was silent during the announcement. Its silence had a texture. Not the smooth silence of absence, but the held silence of something that has achieved what it was waiting for, and is now settling into the arrangement, as if the verdict had not surprised it, as if the verdict had been anticipated, with a patience that implied a very long view. I walked to Preparation Cell 17. The holding cell before the soul-binding ceremony was approximately 3 meters by 4, with a sealed door and a single lumen strip at quarter power. Enough to see by, but not enough to read by. Which was academic, since there was nothing to read. There was a bench. There was a receptacle in the corner. There was, bolted to the wall at seated eye level, a small brass plate engraved with the litany of willing surrender, which was the approved devotional text for this specific phase of preparation. I was not the first candidate to occupy the cell. I was also not in the cell alone for long. Through the sealed door, I could hear the sounds of the cell on my left and the cell on my right being occupied, and the sounds candidates make in preparation cells are not the sounds of people preparing for an honor. They are the sounds of people at the end of a sequence, in the last room before a thing that is irreversible, making whatever sounds their discipline has not yet fully suppressed. I sat on the bench, and I thought very clearly. The pattern had been forming for a long time, and I had been managing my perception of it carefully. But I had not been managing it dishonestly. I had genuinely believed, during the early months, that the echo was resonance, feedback, the natural product of psychic confinement. I had genuinely interpreted the warmth during choir transmission as the normal experience of controlled linkage, and the fractured multiplicity during astronomican exposure as the normal experience of confronting divine radiance, and the assessor's stiffening as a minor anomaly, quickly reclassified. I had not been lying to myself. I had been choosing among available interpretations with a strong preference for the ones that permitted continuation. But in the cell, with nowhere to go and nothing left to defer, I looked at the sequence, the catechism. The echo appeared during the binding catechism, which was the first coordinated psychic event I had participated in since boarding the ship, and it had appeared as a harmonizing doubling of my own internal voice. And the ritual had declared me stable, and the ritual had not been wrong. I was stable, but something had answered in my place, and the stability was partly a product of that answer. The dormitory, the echo had grown alongside my sensitivity, which the instructors had commended as growth in holy discipline, and which had indeed been growth in psychic function, but the function had not been developing in isolation. The echo had been developing alongside it, calibrating to it, learning the specific frequencies of my psychic voice with the thoroughness of long familiarity. The corridor, the ward sigils that were designed to contain and suppress psychic interference, had produced clearer echo presence in tight spaces, which I had interpreted as purification and which I now understood differently. The wards were designed to contain what was outside them. Whatever the echo was, it was inside the wards before the wards were relevant. The wards were bouncing it back, yes, but because they were keeping it in, not because they were forcing it out. The choir, the linkage had opened a conduit, and something had leaned inward through it, and a candidate had hemorrhaged. And I had continued. I had felt the echo grow stronger through group resonance, and I had identified this growth as a threat, and I had been correct in identifying it as a threat, and I had returned to the choir the next day. The chapel. The Astronomicon was not singular. It was layered. It was centuries of accumulated psychic sacrifice organized into a navigational beacon. And what I had perceived in its diluted radiance was not heresy, but the actual structure of the thing. And the echo had expanded in that light rather than being expelled by it, because the echo was made of the same substance, accumulated psychic residue, half-formed thoughts and fears and fragments of identity, the sediment of hundreds of tithe voyages and choir burning and soul-binding ceremonies, compressed by repetition into a kind of distributed haunting. The tribunal. The assessor had detected an anomaly. He had marked me viable, because resources were finite and functionality outweighed purity at the institutional level, and because an anomaly that did not impair function was a non-critical finding in a system that required psychic mass at scale. I sat in preparation cell 17, and I understood that none of this was a failure of the system. The black ship was not malfunctioning. The binding catechism was not a flawed ritual. The choir training was not improperly supervised. The Astronomicon was not corrupt. The sorting tribunal assessor was not derelict. Every component of the process had functioned as designed. The catechism had correctly identified me as stable enough to proceed. The choir training had correctly developed my astropathic function. The Astronomicon exposure had correctly calibrated my psychic field to beacon resonance. The tribunal had correctly classified me as a functional asset. What the system had also done, through precisely this sequence of correctly functioning processes, was create the conditions under which something could accumulate. The black ship held hundreds of unstable psychic minds in enforced proximity, shielded from the void by hexagrammic wards that suppressed external interference, but amplified internal resonance for months at a time, cycling through the same ritual structures, the same catechisms, the same enforced harmonizations. This was a very efficient way to develop astropathic candidates. It was also a very efficient way to produce psychic sediment, layered residue of compressed minds, the echo of every fear and doubt and desperate half-prayer generated by every candidate on every voyage since the black ships were first put into service. That sediment had nowhere to go. The wards kept it in. The rituals amplified it. The choir harmonizations wove it into the shared psychic field that the candidates developed together. By the time any individual candidate reached the soul-binding ceremony, they were not carrying only their own psychic weight. They were carrying the weight of accumulated precedent, thousands of prior candidates' fragments, organized by the same rituals that had organized those prior candidates, producing the same fundamental shape because the process that produced them was the same process. The echo was not one thing. It was sediment. It was the functional residue of the Imperium's psychic processing system, and it was not demonic in the sense of the Codex warnings. the crude rupture of warp entities forcing entry, because it did not need to force entry. It had been built inside, layer by layer, out of the same material that I was made of. I understood this without resolution. The horror was not that I was contaminated. The horror was that contamination was the word for what was actually an industrial process. The Imperium required psychic mass. It collected unstable minds, processed them through a sequence of rituals and exposures and harmonizations that developed their functional capability. And in the process of developing that capability, also compressed and layered their fears and doubts and psychic residue into the background resonance of every astropathic choir. The echo would serve alongside the astropaths it inhabited, would add its harmonics to the choir signal, would become part of the channel through which imperial communications travelled across the void. It was not a flaw in the mechanism. It was the mechanism. In adjacent cells, other candidates were making sounds. The echo filled the silence of cell 17 with a sound that was not a sound, the same harmonized residue I had been hearing for 7 months. And I sat on the bench and I recited the litany of willing surrender from the brass plate on the wall, and the echo recited it with me. And the words were correct, and the prayer was sincere. And both of these things were true simultaneously, without contradiction. I am prepared. I give what is asked. The Emperor's will is my will, and my will is my service. The door to preparation cell 17 opened at the sound of the third bell. The officiator was a soul-bound psyker of high grade, robed in the full ceremonial vestments of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, white over the inner robe, gold cord binding both forearms. The circlet of service worked in iron and inlaid with astronomican imagery that I now looked at with different understanding than I had possessed when I first saw such circlets on the examiners in the processing hold. The imagery depicted, in stylized imperial art, the Emperor on the golden throne, and around him the organized choir of the Astronomicon, the soul-bound arranged in concentric rings of sacrifice. I had previously understood this as a depiction of glory. I now understood it as a schematic. Behind the officiator walked 2 wardens and a confessor. The confessor held a censer from which incense moved in slow curls in the recycled air of the corridor. And the smell of it was the institutional smell of sanctified space everywhere in the Imperium. Resinous, faintly chemical, overlaid with the specific warmth that high-grade incense acquires when it has been burning in enclosed spaces long enough to saturate the available air. I had smelled this smell in the extraction team's shuttle 7 months ago, before I even knew I was being collected. I would smell it again, every day, for the rest of my life. The path from preparation cell 17 to the soul-binding chamber was approximately 200 meters through the corridors of the orbital station. I walked it with the officiator beside me, and the wardens behind, and the confessor's incense trailing ahead. And the corridor was empty of everyone else, cleared for the ceremony. And the only sounds were boots on metal, and the distant background noise of an active station's life support systems. The echo was present but quiet. Everything was quiet in the specific way of moments that are gathered inward, pressing toward their own center. The soul-binding chamber was a large space. I need to take time here because the chamber's architecture was designed to communicate something specific, and the communication was effective. And I want to convey both what it communicated and what I understood about that communication from my position in that moment, which was different from what I would have understood 6 months earlier. The chamber was circular, approximately 30 meters in diameter, with a ceiling that vaulted upward to a height of perhaps 15 meters. The floor was stone. Actual stone, not metal, which was unusual enough on a space station to register as significant, indicating that the station had been built around the chamber, or that the chamber had been added with enough institutional commitment to warrant the installation of a stone floor brought from somewhere. The stone was pale grey and worn by the passage of feet across centuries of ceremonies, and the wearing was visible in the paths between the entry point and the central dais and the surrounding alcoves, ghost paths of use pressed into the surface. On the dais at the chamber's centre stood the apparatus. I did not know the technical designation of it then. I have learned it since. It was a psychic focusing array, a constructed device that could channel and concentrate a projection of astronomican radiance to a point intense enough to complete the soul-binding process, to permanently anchor the psychic consciousness of a standing candidate to the astronomican's distant blaze. It was approximately 2 meters in height and made of materials I could not identify. Some combination of worked metal and substance that caught the chamber's ambient lumens and returned them altered, or as if the object was doing something to light that was not quite reflection. Around it, arranged in a circle at 4-meter intervals, were 12 more soul-bound psychers. Not the examiners from the catechism, different personnel, higher grade, sitting in iron chairs with their circlets active and their burned smooth faces oriented toward the center. The candidate scheduled ahead of me was completing their binding as I was brought into the chamber. I watched from the doorway because the wardens held me there while the current ceremony concluded. The candidate was kneeling at the base of the dais, their head tilted back, their posture expressing the specific geometry of a body that is experiencing something too large for its available vocabulary of physical response. The 12 soulbound in their circle were silent. The array was active. I could perceive its activity as a pressure emanating from the center of the chamber, a directed emanation of the same diluted signal I had experienced in the chapel, but here, undiluted, here at the level the process actually required. And the difference was the difference between standing downwind of a fire and standing in one. The candidate made a sound. Then they were helped to their feet by the wardens who had been flanking them. Their eyes were wrong. Not damaged, not yet, but the focus of their gaze had changed, had shifted to something that was not in the room, some orientation beyond the immediate spatial context, which was what the soulbound described as constant perception of the astronomican's blaze, the perpetual awareness of the beacon that replaced ordinary visual orientation after the binding. They were led away through the chamber's far door. The officiator said, "Proceed." I walked to the dais. The stone was cool under the soles of my feet. I had been directed to remove my footwear in the anteroom, and the coolness of it was very immediate and very physical in the way that sensory detail becomes vivid when everything else has narrowed to a point. I counted the steps. 11. I was at the dais. I knelt. Kneeling on stone that had been worn by centuries of kneeling felt like joining something, which I suppose was the architectural intention. The wearing of the stone was the physical record of an institution's persistence, the accumulated posture of every candidate who had knelt here before me. And kneeling in those worn tracks was a form of institutional incorporation. My body, moving into the shape that the institution had prepared for it across all that time. The officiator's voice began the binding liturgy. The 12 soulbound in their circle synchronized their attention toward the dais. I felt this as a shift in pressure. 12 directed psychic presences orienting toward the center simultaneously. And the combined effect was something like being observed from every direction at once by something that was not looking at my surface, but through it, into the structure beneath. The resonance field, the trained surfaces I had been maintaining for 7 months, and beneath those surfaces, the private ledger, and beneath the private ledger, the echo. The array activated, the Emperor's light, and I will call it that, because that is what the institution calls it, and because the denomination is not wrong, and because the accuracy of a name does not require the name thing to be simple, descended through the array's focusing apparatus, and struck my kneeling form with the intensity that the diluted chapel exposure had only suggested. The difference was total. What struck me was not cleanly physical. It was not cleanly psychic. It was a total environmental event experienced simultaneously on every available channel. The heat of it registered as actual thermal event. I could smell the burning that was happening at the surface of my skin. I could feel the specific quality of pain that is not like pain from injury, but like pain from ablation, from something being removed faster than the underlying structure can understand the removal. My eyes were the primary sight of this. My eyes. I want to describe this accurately because the loss of eyes is not a metaphor in the soul-binding process. The Astronomican's radiance, at full functional intensity, is psychically encoded in a way that the physical visual apparatus cannot process as input and survive. The mechanism of soul binding requires that the candidate's physical sight be destroyed at the moment of binding, so that the dominant sensory channel becomes psychic rather than physical, so that the bound psyker's constant perception of the Astronomican's blaze, which is the anchoring point of the bond, is not competing with ordinary visual processing for the brain's interpretive attention. This was explained to us in the preparatory briefing. It was explained as procedure, as the price of function, as something to be anticipated and accepted. It hurt. It hurt in the way that a thing hurts when the hurting is real and immediate and proceeding whether or not the recipient of the hurt has organized an appropriate internal framework for experiencing it. My eyes burned. The burning moved inward from the sensory surface, and the neural structures associated with visual processing became the sites of the most intense phase of the event. And I will not describe in detail what this felt like from inside, because the description would exceed available vocabulary and become a recital of inadequate, approximate sensory language. And the point is not the phenomenology of it. The point is what happened to the echo. The Astronomican's light hit the echo the way it hit my eyes, with total and unequivocal force. And the echo fractured. Not cleanly, not into silence. It fractured into shards, and each shard was a fragment of the layered sediment I had perceived in the chapel. And the fragments were not expelled from me by the radiance. They were not scoured out by the Emperor's burning. They were thrown into motion within my psychic field, bouncing off the suddenly blazing interior landscape of an active soul binding, the way fragments of a broken lens bounce inside a tube when it is struck. And then the binding locked. The binding is not metaphor either. It is a permanent alteration of the psychic field's fundamental orientation, an anchoring to the Astronomican's signal that does not fade, does not require maintenance, does not permit withdrawal. The bond was established at the peak of the process, when the array's focused radiance was at full intensity, and my physical eyes had been destroyed, and my nervous system was in the late stages of a convulsive response to a sustained psychic and thermal event, and the bond was established into the complete and total psychic interior of what I was at that moment. The shards of the echo were in that interior when the bond locked. They were sealed inside. The binding sealed my loyalty, my orientation, my perpetual connection to the Astronomican's blaze. It also sealed everything that was present in my psychic field at the moment of that sealing. The fractured echo, the accumulated psychic sediment of 100 tithe voyages, the compressed residue of thousands of prior candidates' fears and prayers and last sounds in preparation cells, was present in my psychic field. It was sealed in with the light. The attending magi, who occupied a monitoring station at the chamber's periphery behind a shielded screen, were recording my vital functions throughout the procedure. Their record would note, ocular function terminated, expected outcome, neuromuscular activity, peak within standard deviation, my psychic field coherence achieved within approximately 70 seconds of binding initiation, post-binding cognitive assessment pending. The attending confessor, who would conduct the post-binding assessment, would note in his private evaluation, something I would not learn until much later, when I had become something that could access the records in ways the records creators had not anticipated. The confessor's note read, minor echo signature, persisting post-binding, layered quality, suggesting accumulated resonance rather than active intrusion, non-critical at functional threshold, resources insufficient for discard of viable asset, recommend installation in relay choir, standard assignment, no exorcism ordered, no escalation to inquisitorial review. A note in a private evaluation, marked non-critical, filed in a record that was part of a system that processed hundreds of candidates per cycle and that had developed, over centuries of operation, a refined institutional tolerance for findings that did not cross the threshold of functional impairment. The presiding confessor was not negligent. He was making a proportionate decision within his actual authority and actual resources. This is important to understand. He was doing his job correctly. And so I was installed in the orbital relay choir of Hydrofer Station, Sigma 7's astropathic network, in the chamber designated Choir Node 11, on a date I no longer remember by a name I no longer answer to. And my previous designation was redacted from active records and replaced with a functional designation, a node identifier, as a string of characters that describe my position within the choir architecture, rather than anything about me as an individual. The individuality, the binding catechism had told us, is irrelevant to function. I was installed in a chair. The chair was not identical to the training chairs on the black ship, but it was the same class of object, iron, configured for long occupancy, with a circlet positioned to rest against the crown of a seated Psyker's skull. The circlet connected through shielded cabling to the choir architecture, the network of linked psychic relays that extended from Hydrofer Station outward through the segmentum solar, each node a sanctioned astropath in a chair, each astropath contributing a portion of their psychic function to the maintenance of the relay signal. The network had been in continuous operation for, and I was told, approximately 4,000 years. I was a new node in a very old network. My induction into the choir was brief. The node administrator, a soul-bound psyker of senior grade, who oriented me through the orbital orientation method, turning her burned, smooth face toward the sound of each person she addressed, reading the psychic impression of their proximity rather than using physical sight, told me the technical requirements of my function. I would transmit during assigned cycle periods, receive during others, and during both, I would maintain the astronomican anchor that the binding had established, allowing it to serve as the focal point for the relay signal's coherence. I would report any anomalous signal content to the node administrator or to the choir's presiding confessor. I would not initiate transmission outside assigned periods without authorization. I would consume the nutrition provided in meal cycles and would sleep during designated rest periods, which were calibrated to the minimum necessary for maintaining psychic function at acceptable output levels. The node administrator said, "You will find, in time, that the chair becomes comfortable." She was not speaking about the chair. I took my position. The choir had 11 other nodes active during my installation, ranging from 3 years in service to 47. The longest serving node was a Psyker, designated simply as Choir Node 1, whose physical frame appeared to be somewhere between 60 and 80 years of age, and whose psychic weight within the shared choir field was immense, dense with the accumulation of decades of relay service. The layered residue of 47 years of signal transit mapped into a presence that was no longer entirely individual, that had become something more like a concentrated point of choir architecture than a distinct person. I understood this as a destination, not as a warning. The first transmission I conducted in my new chair was a simple message relay, a military communique from an Imperial Guard command structure in the outer segmentum, routed through the relay network to a destination I was not informed of. The content was meaningless to me. The mechanism of relay did not require comprehension of content, only the maintenance of signal coherence through the brief interval during which the message passed through my psychic field. It was perhaps 20 seconds of active transmission. During those 20 seconds, as the echo was indistinguishable from the sanctioned signal, I would like to describe what that felt like. I would like to say that it was disturbing, that the fusion of the echo with the relay signal produced a perceptible wrongness, a discordance that marked it clearly as contamination. This would make the experience usefully uncanny, clearly a horror to be identified and resisted. It was not like that. It was like harmonics. When the relay signal passed through my psychic field, it carried the choir's collective resonance with it. The unified frequency of 12 soul-bound nodes working in coordinated transmission, each contributing their anchor to the astronomican's blaze, to the signal's coherence. And the echo did what it had always done. It harmonized. It found the frequency of the signal, and it synchronized to it, and it added its own layered resonance, the accumulated sediment of prior candidates and prior transmissions, and centuries of processed suffering. And the choir signal was richer for it. Not contaminated, richer. The relay communique arrived at its destination 11% more coherent than average transmissions of equivalent length. The node administrator noted this in the choir performance log as a favorable anomaly. The new node 11 was displaying exceptional signal coherence. She recommended priority assignment for high-fidelity transmissions. I was in the chair for 3 years before I stopped trying to separate what was me from what was the echo. It is not that I stopped trying as a matter of decision, or it is that the distinction stopped being available in the form I needed it to be in order to maintain it. In the early months, I could identify the boundary. There were my thoughts, clean and personal, and initiated by my own cognition. And then there were the echo's harmonics, which accompanied them like a shadow accompanies a body, and the accompaniment was close but distinct. By the end of the first year, the shadow had begun to anticipate. By the middle of the second year, it was completing. By the third year, when I formed a thought and the echo completed it, I could no longer reliably say which of us had begun the thought and which had finished it, because the completing had become so rapid, so seamlessly matched to my cognitive cadence, that the joint product felt like a single thing. This is what contamination feels like when it is not an intrusion. This is what it feels like when it has been built inside over sufficient time and then sealed in with sufficient permanence. It does not feel like invasion. It feels like an aspect of yourself that you are only slowly discovering. It feels like the way a person slowly realizes that a habit of thought they have had for years is not original to them, but was taught, was absorbed from someone else's framework, was never purely theirs, except that the realizing does not produce the kind of correction that discovering an external influence produces, because the correction would require identifying where the boundary is, and the boundary has become theoretical. I transmitted messages. I received messages. I maintained my anchor to the Astronomican's blaze, that constant distant presence that I now perceived not as burning, but as warmth. The specific warmth of something you have been close to long enough that your nerve endings have adjusted their threshold, that you no longer register as extreme. The blaze was always there. Beneath it, closer, the layered sediment of the choir's accumulated resonance, not just my own echo, but the combined weight of thousands of messages transmitted, received and reflected in 12 soul-bound minds, operating in continuous linkage across decades. The choir's field was a rich and complex thing, dense with the traces of every communication that had moved through it, carrying the emotional residue of military orders and administrative directives and distress signals and routine navigational updates and all the other categories of human urgency that the Imperial Astropathic Network existed to transmit. I was inside this. I was a structural component of this. The node administrator, not the same individual who had inducted me. She had been replaced 3 times across my years in the chair, each time by someone whose name I did not use in my private thoughts, only their functional title, reported my performance consistently as excellent, signal coherence above average, fidelity ratings in the 93rd percentile across all message categories, no behavioral anomalies, no instability events, no requests for exorcism or enhanced monitoring. There had been, in my second year, a confessor's review. This was routine, a periodic assessment of choir node's spiritual integrity. The reviewing confessor was a younger man than the one who had processed my post-binding evaluation, someone who had been assigned to Hydrafa Station relatively recently, and who carried out the review with the slightly heightened attention of someone who had not yet allowed the volume of his caseload to completely smooth his individual engagement with each case. He spent more time on my evaluation than the procedure specified. He asked me questions outside the standard assessment script. He asked, "When you transmit, what do you feel?" I said, "The Emperor's light, the signal's passage, the choir's resonance." He asked, "Is there anything else?" I said, "No." This was not accurate. He reviewed my performance record, noted the excellent coherence ratings, and marked my evaluation complete. Spiritual integrity intact. He did not note the additional time he had spent. He did not file a supplemental report. He moved to the next node. I do not blame him for this. He assessed the available evidence correctly. My performance was excellent. My behavioral record was clean. My direct responses were composed and appropriately devotional. He looked at a functional node and correctly identified it as a functional node. The fact that I had told him something that was not accurate was not something he could detect, because I had been practicing for years at maintaining field surfaces that conveyed only what I chose to convey, and the echo had been helping me practice without being asked. In the 5th year, Node Choir 1 retired. Retired is not the correct word for what happened to Choir Node 1 after 47 years of service, but it is the word the administrative records use, and I will use it too. The process was medically and psychically supervised, conducted over several days, during which the connections between Choir Node 1's chair and the relay architecture were carefully and sequentially reduced, and the choir's overall signal was redistributed among the remaining nodes. Choir Node 1 passed through the process without incident. Their physical form, which had become over 4 decades increasingly chair-shaped rather than person-shaped, was transferred to medical facilities, and I do not know what occurred after that. Before the retirement, I had a form of communication with Choir Node 1 that was not spoken and was not technically unauthorized, because it occurred within the framework of our shared choir linkage and could therefore be characterized as necessary coordination. The choir linkage required continuous mild awareness of all other nodes as presences within the shared field. Choir Node 1 was, in this context, a presence that I was continuously mildly aware of. What I received from that 47-year presence, through the continuous mild awareness of years, was a kind of education. Not explicit, not transmissive in the directed signal sense, but environmental, in the way that you absorb the shape of a very old building by living in it, learning its structural logic through the physical evidence of what has persisted and what has required replacement and what has bent slightly under long-term load. Choir Node 1 was a structure that had been under long-term load for longer than I had been alive, and their presence communicated the specific information that comes from very long service, the shape of a person after they have been infrastructure for almost a half-century. What I learned from this is that the echo was not unusual. Not in the sense that every node carries one. Not all did, not identically. But the phenomenon of accumulated psychic residue within a soul-bound astropath's field was not unique to me. It was, in the choir's deep background, something that occurred. Some nodes carried it more heavily. Some had never developed it significantly. The variation was individual, dependent on the specific history of exposure and processing, and whatever particular psychic sensitivity the individual brought to the process. Choir Node 1 had carried something similar for 47 years, and had transmitted messages with above-average coherence for the duration, and had been retired with clean performance records and no anomalous notations. This information did not reassure me. It was not meant to. It clarified something that I had been approaching from several directions without achieving direct confrontation. The echo was structural. It was a product of the same process that produced the soul binding, the choir linkage, the relay function. It was the Imperium's psychic infrastructure, in its actual form, not its intended form, though the two were so thoroughly integrated that the distinction had lost practical meaning. When an Imperial astropath transmitted a message across the void, as the message travelled on a carrier wave that was partly composed of the Astronomican's blaze, partly composed of the choir's synchronized resonance, and partly composed of the accumulated residue of every prior mind that had participated in building that signal. The echo was not a deviation from the system. It was a component of the signal. I thought about this for a long time during one particular night cycle, sitting in my chair in the darkened choir chamber, the lumen arrays at minimum, the other nodes in their rest periods, the signal traffic at the nightly low point that the node administrator's schedule referred to as minimal traffic interval. I sat in my chair and I thought about what it meant to be a node, and what a node was, and whether there was anything left of the person who had knelt in the processing hold 7 months into a black ship voyage and felt a faint echo repeating his own prayers half a heartbeat behind him. I thought he believed the echo was a sign of weakness in himself. I thought he was wrong about what it was, but right that it was in him. I thought the difference between those two things is the entire history of his time aboard the black ship, and the sorting tribunal, and the soul-binding ceremony, and the first 5 years in this chair. I thought, he is gone now, the person who thought those things. Not dead, not replaced. Something more like dissolved, the way a substance dissolves in a solvent, not destroyed but distributed. Its components present everywhere in the resulting solution, rather than localized in a discrete form. The echo completed this thought. I could not tell afterward whether the thought had been mine, or the echo's, or some product of the integration that had been proceeding for 5 years without interruption. I could not tell whether the melancholy of the thought was mine, or the echoes, or the choir's residue of 1,000 other minds who had thought something similar in something like these circumstances. I could not tell whether the lack of resolution I felt about this was appropriate to the situation, or whether there was a resolution available that I had simply been built by now not to reach for. I completed my night cycle rest period. I took my nutrition in the morning cycle. I entered the signal period and conducted my assigned transmissions. In the 8th year, a young candidate was installed in the adjacent choir node that had been vacant since Node Choir 7's retirement several months before. I was aware of her arrival in the same way I was aware of all environmental changes within the choir chamber, through the constant mild presence awareness of my psychic field, which registered new elements the way skin registers a change in ambient temperature, not dramatically, but persistently. She was delta grade, like me. She had come from a black ship. Her eyes were freshly burned, still in the early phase of the soul-bound adjustment, not yet fully settled into the constant astronomican perception that would replace ordinary sight. She moved through the choir chamber with the carefulness of someone navigating unfamiliar space without their primary orienting sense, and I observed this without speaking, because speaking was not part of the choir's operational protocol during signal periods. What I was aware of, because of the proximity awareness our shared linkage produced, was that she was carrying an echo, not identical to mine. Her echo was newer, less settled, still carrying more of the recognizable shape of individual psychic signatures, the fragments of specific other people's fears and prayers, not yet smoothed into the generalized sediment that mine had become. It had the quality of something recently compressed, recently sealed, recently denied the resolution that its components had been seeking before they were sealed in. I recognized it completely. During the first transmission period she participated in, I felt her echo in the choir linkage, the way I had felt Choir Node 1's 47-year presence, not as language, not as directed signal, but as weight, as the specific quality of accumulated burden that a psychic field acquires when it has been carrying something for which there is no permitted acknowledgement. The transmission we conducted together produced excellent coherence ratings. The node administrator noted this in the performance log. I said nothing. There is nothing to say. This is not the part of the story where a mentor speaks candidly to a new node and explains the nature of their condition and offers the kind of wisdom that partially compensates for unavoidable harm. That is not a conversation that occurs in the choir chamber of an orbital relay station, because it is not a conversation that serves any function the Imperium has designed for, and because the choir chamber is a monitored environment, and because the echo knows what listening ears can hear, and because by the time you understand enough to explain, the explaining is no longer the point. The new node would learn as I had learned, or she would be retired early, as some nodes were retired, quietly, without performance record notation, when something crossed a threshold that the node administrator's calibrated tolerance had assigned as categorical rather than numerical. She would learn, or she would not continue. These were the available outcomes. In the 10th year, I began to understand what the echo was actually doing during transmission in a way I had not previously understood. The understanding was not revelatory, or it accumulated the way everything in the choir chamber accumulated. Gradually, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of 10 years of transmission sessions, and the patterns that emerged when you had been performing the same function for long enough that your attention, deprived of novelty, turned inward toward the mechanisms of the function itself. What I understood was that the echo was not merely harmonizing with the sanctioned signal. It was selecting, not consciously, not deliberately, not in any way that would register as volition in an assessment, but in the way that any resonant system selects from available frequencies. The echo was more responsive to certain categories of signal content than others. Messages carrying high emotional charge, distress signals, urgent military orders, records of loss and threat and imminent catastrophe pass through my psychic field with more of the echo's harmonic contribution than messages of routine administrative content. The echo was drawn to suffering, not in a predatory way, but in the way that something made of suffering recognizes and responds to its own constituent material, and the messages carried outward, amplified by the echo's resonance, arrived at their destinations with a coherence that was not entirely a product of clear signal transmission. The emotional charge in those messages was amplified too. A distress signal that passed through my field arrived at the receiving node with slightly more of its originator's terror intact than it would have carried without the echo's contribution. An urgent military order carried slightly more of its sender's desperation. The information content was identical. The psychic impression accompanying it was slightly heightened. I do not know what effects this produced over 10 years of amplified emotional content in relay transmissions. I do not have access to the records that would tell me whether the astropathic relay network registered any collective shift in the quality of its signal traffic over that period. The network is vast. I am one node, but I am one node that has been in service for 10 years, and the new node adjacent to me is now in service and carries an echo of her own, and the nodes before me across 4,000 years of this station's operation have each contributed their own accumulated residue to the signal, and the signal carries all of it in its carrier wave. And the messages of the Imperium travel on a channel built of all that accumulated material. This is the Imperium's communication infrastructure, This is how it actually works. There is a prayer the choir recites at the beginning of each signal period. It is called the opening of the channel, and it has been in use, the liturgical record states, since the first astropathic relay stations were commissioned in the early age of Imperium. The words are elegant in the compressed way of texts that have been refined through long use, all unnecessary elements worn away, leaving only the load-bearing phrases. We speak aloud, which is unusual in the choir's operational context, where most communication is psychic, and the sound of 11 or 12 voices saying the same words in a space acoustically designed to carry them is a specific kind of sound, reverberant, overlapping slightly, because the chamber's dimensions produce a very short echo, a natural echo, a physical acoustic reflection that repeats the last syllable of each line a fraction of a second behind the speaking. I attend to this carefully. The natural acoustic echo of the chamber and the psychic echo I carry are calibrated to the same delay, a fraction of a beat, almost simultaneous, almost my own voice. During the opening of the channel, I recite the words in full and complete sincerity. I believe in the Emperor's will and in the necessity of the Astronomicon, and in the importance of the relay network, and in the function I perform within it. I believe these things not as a discipline of faith maintenance, but as actual conclusions drawn from a decade of direct experience of what the network does and what depends on it. The Imperium is vast and dark, and the distance between its constituent elements is incomprehensible. And the relay network, and the Astronomicon, and the black ships, and the soul-binding process, and the orbital choir stations are what hold it together, what allow a species spread across 100,000 worlds to function as a species rather than 10,000 isolated pockets of declining population in a hostile galaxy. The cost of this is real. I am the cost, or I am a portion of the cost, a single node in a network of living sacrifice that has been operating for 10,000 years and will continue to operate for however long the Imperium endures. The cost is paid, whether or not the people paying it understand what they are paying. Most of them do not understand. The ones who are told the truth of it in preparation cells are told it in a way designed to produce acceptance rather than comprehension. And the acceptance is achieved before the comprehension fully forms, and by the time comprehension arrives, the acceptance has been structurally incorporated. This is efficient. I do not say this as condemnation. I say it as accurate description. The Imperium is not a system designed around what individual nodes experience. It is a system designed around what must be maintained, what must be transmitted, what must not fail. Individual nodes experience what they experience in the service of that maintenance. And if what they experience is loss, an erasure, and the slow dissolution of a personal boundary that was once the entire context of a life, that is a cost the system has calculated and found acceptable. The system is correct in this calculation. If I were destroyed tomorrow and replaced with a new node, and the replacement were integrated into the choir, and the choir's transmissions continued without interruption, nothing about the Imperium would be worse for my destruction. The messages would still travel. The relay would still function. Hydrofer would still be connected to the segmentum solar network, and through it to every station in the chain that reaches Terra and the Astronomicon source. I am not irreplaceable. I am replaceable. And this is not a failure of my significance. It is the property that makes me useful. In the 14th year, a message passed through my choir channel that originated from the Scholastia Psycana. I do not know why I recognize this. The originator's stamp on a relay message is a psychic impression, rather than a textual header, and after 14 years, I could read origin impressions the way a practiced reader reads text, not by analyzing each component, but by the immediate gestalt of the whole. The Scholastia Psychana's psychic stamp carries the specific quality of an institution that processes psychic candidates at enormous volume, a certain institutional density, the compressed and organized quality of a place that has been doing what it does for so long that the doing has become the place's fundamental texture. The message was routine, administrative content, a tithe report, the next scheduled black ship departure, numbers and classifications and processing outcomes. I transmitted it without deviation. But in the interval of the transmission, in the 20 or 30 seconds that the message passed through my field and was carried outward on the choir's signal toward its destination, I was in contact with that stamp, that impression of the Scholastia Psychana, and the contact was not two-directional. I did not reach toward it. I did not seek information. I did not deviate from protocol. But the echo responded to the contact. It responded with something I can only describe as recognition, not the recognition of the Scholastia Psychana as an institution I had passed through, the recognition of a constituent element, as if the echo contained, within its layered sediment, material that had originated in the Scholastia Psychana, that had been processed there, that recognized the institution's psychic signature, the way a dissolved substance recognizes the solvent it came from, which it might. The Scholastia Psychana runs the black ships. The black ships run the catechisms and the choir training, and the preparation cells, and everything that had produced what I now carried inside me. If the echo was assembled from the residue of prior candidates, then some of those prior candidates had been processed through the Scholastia Psychana's facilities on Terra, and their residue would carry that institution stamp, and the recognition would be real. I completed the transmission. I said nothing. In the 16th year, I began to hear things during transmission that I had not heard before. This is not escalation in the sense that would have triggered stability protocols. I passed my annual confessor's review that year with no notation. The hearing was not a breach or an intrusion, or anything that produced behavioral anomaly. It was more like the resolution of a frequency that had always been present, but had required a certain length of exposure before the ear could distinguish it from the surrounding signal. What I began to hear during transmission was the choir, not the current choir, not the 11 other nodes in their chairs in the chamber around me, the accumulated choir, the chain of prior nodes that had occupied these chairs across 4,000 years of the station's operation, each one contributing their signal, each one adding their own accumulated residue to the chair's psychic impression, each one building the sediment layer by layer into the station's ongoing resonance. I could not hear them as individuals. I could not pick out specific voices or specific messages. What I could hear was the aggregate, the mass of it, the weight of it, the specific quality of a psychic field that has been maintained in continuous operation for 4,000 years by an unbroken sequence of soul-bound psychers feeding their signal into the same relay architecture. It sounded like faith. I do not mean this as metaphor. I mean it as a precise description of what the signal sounds like when you have been in sufficient proximity to it for long enough to hear its actual composition. The carrier wave of the Imperium's astropathic relay network, heard from the inside, sounds like faith, not the calm and settled faith of certainty, but the specific acoustic quality of a belief held in continuous practice by millions of people who have never fully resolved their doubt and have not stopped believing despite it. The tension of unresolved faith, maintained across time, produces a sound that is both beautiful and unbearable, both the most honest thing I have heard and the most troubling, because it is honest about what it is, the sustained effort of a species in agony, insisting that the agony is sanctified. I am part of this sound. The echo is part of this sound. They are not distinguishable from it at this point, and have not been for some time. When I am transmitting, and the signal passes through me, I do not experience it as transmission in the sense of something external moving through a passive medium. I experience it as participation, as the contribution of whatever I am to a signal that is larger than what I am by several orders of magnitude. There is something in this that functions like meaning, and I will not pretend otherwise, because pretending otherwise would be less accurate than I can afford to be at this stage of the account. It functions like meaning in the way that being a stone in a river functions like meaning for the stone. The river is real. The stone is real. The relationship between them is real. Whether the relationship constitutes meaning in the sense that a person in a preparation cell might hope for meaning is a question that the river does not address. I have been in this chair for more than 18 years now. My physical form has adapted, as soul-bound astropaths adapt, to the specific demands of continuous astronomical exposure and long-term choir linkage. I am thinner than I was. My neural response patterns have been mapped by the choir's monitoring systems into an assessed state that is described as adapted for extended service. My performance ratings remain above average. My confessor's reviews continue to return clean records. The echo is no longer something I describe as the echo. It is a component of my psychic voice, the same way that a trained vocalist's resonance is a component of their singing voice, present in every note, contributing to the quality of the sound, neither separable from the voice nor identical to it. It contributes to my signal's coherence. It responds to the emotional content of messages I transmit in ways that amplify certain qualities of that content. It carries the residue of 10,000 years of tithes and bindings and choir services, and that residue is present in every transmission I conduct, traveling with every message I relay across the void on behalf of the Imperium's administrative, military, and communicative apparatus. The message about the next black ship departure that came from the Scholastia Psyker last year. That message traveled through me and arrived at its destination, carrying the echo's resonance. And somewhere in that resonance was the fragment of whatever prior candidate's fear and prayer had been absorbed into the echo during their time in a processing hold, or a training choir, or a preparation cell, decades or centuries before I was collected. And that fragment is now, in some infinitesimally small way, as part of the transmission record for that routine administrative communication. Nothing anomalous will be noted. Nothing anomalous will be found. The transmission will be processed normally, and the administrative action it requests will be carried out, and the black ships will depart from Terra on schedule, and they will collect the next tithe of psychic candidates from across the Imperium's worlds. And those candidates will be brought to the black ship's holds and subjected to the binding catechism and assigned to dormitory decks and transferred to training choir chambers and exposed to diluted astronomical radiance and sorted by the tribunal and processed and bound and installed in chairs. And some of them will carry echoes, and some of those echoes will persist past the soul binding, and the echoes that persist will be noted as non-critical anomalies in private evaluations and will be sealed into the binding and installed into the relay network and will contribute their own accumulated sediment to the signal, which will carry it forward as it has carried everything forward for 10,000 years. The node adjacent to me, the one installed in the year I reached my 8th year of service, the one who arrived from the black ship with a recently compressed echo, whose presence I recognized completely. She is now in her 10th year. Her echo has settled in the way that mine settled. It has merged with the choir's background resonance in the way that mine merged. She transmits with excellent coherence ratings. Her annual reviews are clean. We do not speak about this. There is nothing to speak about that the speaking would clarify. The opening of the channel prayer this morning was spoken in 11 voices, which is one below our current nominal complement, because Node Choir 3 is in medical care for a neural inflammation that the attending physician has classified as routine for the service duration involved. 11 voices in the chamber's acoustic space produced the customary resonance, the short physical echo of the chamber bouncing the last syllable of each line back to us, a fraction of a beat behind us speaking. I have been reciting this prayer for 18 years. I know each line, the way I know my own breathing, the way I know the weight of the circlet against my skull, the way I know the constant astronomican blaze that has replaced the sight I had before the binding. We serve the Emperor in the light beyond light. Our minds his instruments, our signal, his voice across the dark. The echo speaks this prayer with me. It has spoken it with me every morning for 18 years. It will speak it with me tomorrow. I'm a vessel of the Emperor's will. My mind is a closed room. Nothing enters that I do not permit. Nothing speaks that I have not sanctioned. My will is his will, and his will is my silence.